right. Now, our presenter tonight is going to be presenting on his recent publication, Lincoln the Citizen, which is going to be a culmination of Henry Clay Whitney's papers, who was a lawyer and friend of Abraham Lincoln. His other books include Lincoln the President, March 4th, 1861 to May 3rd, 1865. Professor Michael Burlingame is a professor of history and the Lynn Distinguished Chairperson at the University of Illinois in Springfield. He has written and edited 21 Lincoln books, among them The Black Man's President, Abraham Lincoln, African Americans and the Pursuit of Racial Equality and an American Marriage, The Untold Story of Abraham Lincoln, and Mary Todd. Now, let's welcome Michael, and we'll get to learn a little bit more about Lincoln's time here in the state of Illinois.
Well, thank you, William. I'm glad to be with you this evening.
Yes, thank you. And if anyone has any questions during the presentation tonight, you will not be able to unmute your microphone or turn your camera on, but you will have access to the chat. So if you do have any questions, make sure to put them there and we'll have them addressed.
Okay, so I should tell you a little bit about how I came to edit this book. When I was doing research for my large 2,000-page Lincoln biography, Abraham Lincoln: A Life, which appeared in 2008. I traveled around the country. This was mostly during the pre-Google era, conducting research in repositories at universities, public libraries, historical societies, and the like. And I was in Harrogate, Tennessee, in the Appalachians of East Tennessee, and Lincoln Memorial University had a nice little collection. And one of the things I found there, this was many years ago, was a handwritten manuscript by Henry C. Whitney of Champaign, a biography of Lincoln in two separate volumes, one called Lincoln the President for the pre-presidential years, Lincoln the Citizen, and then Lincoln the President for the presidential years. And I was struck by the handwritten manuscript of the first volume because it contained a lot of information that doesn't show up elsewhere about Lincoln's early life. And that Lincoln told Henry Whitney a lot about his early life. And we know that from Whitney's book and from another book that Whitney wrote called Life on the Circuit with Lincoln. And I was astounded to see that some of the most interesting information in that manuscript had been left on the cutting room floor when the book was published posthumously back in 1907. And so I vowed to myself way back when, this is many years ago, that one day I was going to do an edition of Henry Whitney's Lincoln the Citizen, which was, to my mind, an underappreciated source of information about Lincoln. And I would restore all of the material that was left on the cutting room floor, much of which had to do with Lincoln's early life, and that make that available to students and scholars, because it was information from somebody who knew Lincoln well, who spent a great deal of time with Lincoln, traveling the 8th Judicial Circuit, where lawyers would go out from various towns and cities on the 8th Circuit, and they would go for the spring and then in the fall for months, traveling from one county seat to another and holding court and representing clients. And Lincoln was on those circuit tours almost every year. And he was one of the few lawyers who would start at the beginning of the circuit and stay until the end of the circuit. He was the only lawyer who didn't go home on weekends because his home life was so turbulent. And he spent a lot of time chatting with his fellow lawyers, including Whitney. And Whitney was therefore in a position to write about Lincoln's early life and pre-presidential career in general, because he'd spent several years touring the circuit with Lincoln, and Lincoln would tell him about his early life. And so much of what shows up in this underutilized and underappreciated biography is that many aspects of Lincoln's early life show up here and no place else. And Whitney did not keep track in a diary or any similar journal about his daily interactions with Lincoln, but he does in reminiscences talk about how he would spend a great deal of time with Lincoln and how Lincoln would open up to him about his early life in Kentucky and then in Indiana and then in Illinois. So I had postponed that project while I had a number of other things to do. I finally got around to it, and it was just published last March. And it is not only a valuable primary source material for Lincoln scholars, but it's also a valuable sketch of Lincoln's character and personality by a man who knew Lincoln well, who spent a lot of time with him, and with whom Lincoln was willing to unburden himself, as he usually didn't to other people. He was rather shut-mouthed about his personal life. But to Whitney, he seemed drawn. Whitney was much younger, about a generation younger, and so he was a kind of surrogate son to Lincoln, who acted in that capacity as a kind of mentor and surrogate father to many young lawyers on the circuit. And the principal one, of course, that people know about is William Herndon, who was Lincoln's law partner for 16 years before he became president. And his biography, Herndon's biography, is extremely valuable. Whitney's biography is a valuable supplement to Herndon's biography because they were a couple of the people who knew Lincoln very well during his 1850s, his pre-presidential years, and could report with some authority on how Lincoln behaved, what he thought, what he said, how he acted. And so this is an attempt to expand the database of information that future Lincoln scholars will have to for writing there about Lincoln as a lawyer, about Lincoln as an anti-slavery advocate, and Lincoln and Lincoln's personal life. So that's in a nutshell is how the book came to be written or edited by me, and why it is an important contribution to Lincoln studies.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think one of the things that most of our participants are going to be interested in are primarily to know if Whitney had any discussions in his biography about Lincoln's time during the Eighth Circuit, which took him through Champaign County in eastern Illinois.
Oh yes, Lincoln has a great deal to say about life on the circuit, and Whitney's previous book, the one I mentioned, Life on the Circuit with Lincoln, has many anecdotes that don't show up elsewhere. And most scholars are inclined to believe that what Whitney had to say about Lincoln on the circuit was accurate and reliable and valuable information. So the specific emphasis on Lincoln as a circuit rider is more heavily emphasized in that earlier book called Life on the Circuit, which everybody knows about. Every Lincoln scholar consults it. And it's something of a mixed bag. It's got all kinds of other material aside from his reminiscences of the days that he spent with Lincoln on the circuit. And this book that was published in March, the full version of Lincoln the Citizen, is concentrated more on Lincoln himself and Lincoln's character, and doesn't specific focus in on Champaign County, but on Lincoln in general, and has a lot to say about the circuit. But a lot of that was preceded by his more extensive account of Lincoln as a circuit lawyer in that book, Life on the Circuit with Lincoln.
Got it. Then, at the very least, before we continue, does anyone have any questions in the chat that they'd like to post? All right, well, we'll let them have a minute or two to make any questions that they have. That being said, one question that I had is I was interested to know how Whitney was able to portray, or what inferences did he have on the evolutions of Lincoln's character as he evolved from a judge into a statesman on his journey to the White House.
Well, Lincoln's political career was really in two separate stages. He entered politics as a young man in his early 20s and ran for office as a state legislator in Illinois from Sangamon County in 1832. And so in the 1830s and the 1840s was the first stage of Lincoln's political campaign. And then at the age of 40, he dropped out of politics for all intents and purposes. And for 5 years, he was on the political sidelines. And then in 1854, a crucial year in American history when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed by Congress, which allowed slavery to move into territories, millions of acres that had been set aside for freedom by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. And that caused a huge uproar and led to the foundation of the Republican Party and eventually the overthrow of the Democratic control of the government. And so in the first portion of his career, he was something of a low road politician. That is, he engaged in a lot of sarcasm and ridicule of Democrats. That was standard brand frontier politics, to pour contempt and sarcasm and ridicule on your political opponents. And Lincoln doesn't have a great deal to say about slavery, a little bit, but not much. And then he takes off 5 years between age of 40 and 45, and then he comes back in 1854, and that's just when he meets Whitney. So this second phase of Lincoln's political career from 1854 to his election in 1860 is a particularly interesting period because Lincoln emerges from his earlier career, that is the 1830s and 1840s, when he was in his 20s and 30s, where he was, as I say, something of a low road politician. And then in 1854, when he comes back from 5 years on the sidelines, he is a high road politician. No more ridicule, no more sarcasm, no more pouring contempt on Democrats, but addressing the slavery issue and a high-minded, passionate, logical, and moral perspective that really made him a national figure. And Whitney witnessed all that. He was with him not only as a lawyer practicing on the circuit, but Whitney was a committed opponent of slavery and an enthusiastic Republican. And we have correspondence between Lincoln and Whitney throughout this period. And then so that they were very close for 1850 to 1860, 1854 to 1860. And actually, he then goes to Washington, and Lincoln appoints him to a federal office, a paymaster in the Army. And so this crucial period, 1854 to 1860, there's a lot of good evidence about what Lincoln was like at that time, what he thought, what he looked like, how he behaved, and that Whitney reports that others tend to corroborate, but he adds extra detail and extra richness to the story and makes it and his character sketch of Lincoln is quite telling. His qualities, his candor, his industry, and his various capacities as a lawyer and also as a political figure and as a friend, as a fellow lawyer practicing before Judge David Davis on the Eighth Judicial Circuit.
I was wondering, it doesn't look like we have any questions yet from the crowd, but like I said, if you do have any questions during Michael's talk, feel free, put them in the chat and we can have those addressed. Otherwise, we'll have another Q&A at the end that you're welcome to ask any questions that you have. But while we wait, one thing that I'd like you to expound upon a little bit further, I'm interested to know what were kind of the leading causes for Lincoln to drop out of politics in 1840 and then caused him to get this resurgence back in 1845?
Well, it's in 1849, he turned 40, and he had just finished his one term as a U.S. congressman. Lincoln's experience on the national level prior to his election to president was a 2-year term in the House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849. And he didn't run for re-election because there was an agreement, an informal agreement among the Whigs. Lincoln was a Whig, the leading party opposing the Democrats, uh, that there were other ambitious Whigs in the Lincoln's district. And so they agreed to share it. That one would run one time, and then he would yield to another, and then Lincoln would yield. And so Lincoln stepped down after his one term in order to allow a fellow Whig, who was a good friend of his actually, to run for the seat that Lincoln held. So his the end of his national political career in 1849 was not because he was afraid he would lose the election. That is widely misunderstood. And so then he comes back from Washington. He's in Illinois, um, and he goes through what I describe as a midlife crisis. That is, for 5 years, he's sitting on the political sidelines. He occasionally gives a talk, but they're very, very few and very superficial. And this happens to lots of men, according to modern psychological studies. A lot of men in their early 40s go through a period of profound introspection where they ask themselves, have I made the right marital choice? Have I made the right career choice? Have I devoted too much time and energy to pleasing others rather than developing my own unique capabilities? What do I want to leave as a legacy? What's truly important? And this we sometimes lump together under the term of midlife crisis, which is really a midlife transition from the first half of life to the second half. And men are inclined to think in these terms and become introspective because they realize for the first time that they probably spent more time alive than they have left, and that this does lead to a reassessment of what you're really care about most, what you're really uh, going to do to develop your own personality, your own characteristic, your own legacy. And so I think Lincoln is in that position. Unfortunately, Lincoln does not keep a diary. He doesn't write letters to intimate friends talking about his inner life and his emotional states. But we do know what he looked like at age 40, which was pretty much a low road politician. And we know what he looked like in 1854. So between 49 and 54, he's on the side. And all of a sudden, he's a different man. He's a different kind of politician. And this oftentimes happens as a result of the midlife, when that period of introspection can lead some men to have tremendous psychological growth. And Lincoln seems to be a classic example of that. And one of the hallmarks of a person who has achieved a kind of psychological growth like the one that Lincoln did is that they overcome the tyranny of the ego. They're no longer so egocentric, and they are willing to accept disagreement, and not take criticism personally, um, and to cooperate with others in a common enterprise. And so that makes him an ideally suitable candidate for organizing the Republican Party. The Republican Party in Illinois in the 1850s is really Lincoln's creation. He's the one who takes the leadership role. He harmonizes the factions. He is the most eloquent spokesman for the principles of the Republican Party and the anti-slavery movement. Um, and then when he becomes president, that psychological maturity, that unwillingness to quarrel, that unwillingness to take criticism personally, the unwillingness to personalize politics, stood him in good stead and made him an exceptionally gifted leader. And it's been said sometimes by historians that if a man like Lincoln, with his leadership capabilities and his psychological maturity, had been president of the South, and a man like Jefferson Davis, who was very quarrelsome, who was always taking offense, who was quarreling with his cabinet members, with his vice president, with his Congress, with his press, with his generals, all the time. Uh, that that if a man like Davis had been president of the North and Lincoln president of the South, South might well have won the war. Now, we can't prove that. We can't rerun the experiment with one variable changed, but that seems to me to be a reasonable conclusion. And so this period, which seems to be so unimportant in Lincoln's life, where he doesn't really give major speeches and he's not in office and he's on the political sidelines, seems to be unimportant, but it's actually tremendously important because he undergoes this tremendous surge of psychological growth from a low road politician who pokes fun and ridicules the opposition to a high-minded politician who stresses the moral and political reasons for opposing the expansion of slavery.
Thank you.
And by the way, I'm happy to address any questions your viewers may have about any aspect of Lincoln's life, because as I said, I've written a 2,000-page biography. I haven't just focused on one aspect of Lincoln's life, although obviously for this particular book I did. But that's I'm happy to talk about any aspect of Lincoln's life that your viewers and listeners would be interested in pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. If you do have any questions at all, feel free put those in the chat. We do have a question from Tom, who is interested to know more about Lincoln's cases before the Supreme Court during this era.
Well, Lincoln practiced only once before the United States Supreme Court, and that was a very technical issue. And so he really didn't have a Supreme Court practice aside from that one rather technical case. But Lincoln's attitude toward the Supreme Court, of course, was put on trial by the Dred Scott decision of 1857, where the Supreme Court ruled, injecting itself into politics quite dramatically, that the Republican Party platform, which said slavery shall not be allowed to move into the territories, the huge amount of territory in the West that became several different states as time passed, and that slavery had been forbidden to go into those territories by the Compromise of 1820. And Stephen A. Douglas came along and said that well, we're going to pass a law saying that slavery can go into those territories. The Republicans said, no, 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 no. The Congress has the power to prohibit slavery or to regulate the territories. It's clear cut. It's in the Constitution. There's no ambiguity about it. And that the Republican Party is dedicated to keeping slavery from expanding and thereby putting it on the road to ultimate extinction, which is the phrase Lincoln used. Then the Supreme Court says, oh, no, no, the Republicans, that's illegal, that the Congress cannot pass a law forbidding slavery to go into the territories because that violates the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution stipulates that the federal government may not deny anybody life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That is, you can't be fined, you can't be jailed, you can't be executed unless you have a fair trial. And you have the right to a jury, and you have the right to appeal, and you have the right to testify on your own behalf and to cross-examine witnesses and so on and so forth. And therefore, if you tell a slaveholder that he can't take his slaves into the territories, you're in effect denying him the use of his property, which is a pretty far-fetched argument, but that's what the Supreme Court ruled, a 7-2 decision. And so Lincoln and the Republicans were on the spot because it looked as though the foundation of their political platform was being undermined and eroded by the Supreme Court. And Lincoln said, well, if the Supreme Court rules in a way that is consistent with earlier rulings, that is based on clear-cut principles of constitutional interpretation and so on, then it deserves to be fully honored. But the Supreme Court has been known to change its mind, and we're going to work on cases to try to persuade people that, in fact, the Constitution should be interpreted as we do, namely that it's clear-cut. Congress has the power to regulate, make rules and regulations for the territories. And then on top of that, the question is, well, what did the framers of the Constitution intend? Well, if you look and see the people who sat in the Constitutional Convention, they were also members of the first Congress. And the first Congress, as one of its initial acts, was to reenact the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which said no slavery is allowed above the Ohio River out to the Mississippi, between the Alleghanies and the Mississippi above the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line. And obviously the people who wrote the Constitution believed that the power to prohibit slavery from going into the territories was perfectly legit. So Lincoln's relationship with the Supreme Court was not as so much as a litigant before the court, but as a critic of the court's decision in the highly controversial case of Dred Scott.
All right, thank you. We have another question from the audience, this time from Alan, in reference to his senatorial run before his election to the White House. Alan was wondering whether his family went with him to D.C. during his time as a senator. And I'd like to know, just to further it a little bit more, what his family life looked like during this time frame.
Sure, by all means. Lincoln served as not as a senator, but as a representative for 2 years between 1847 and 49. And his wife and children went with him, but that didn't work out so well. And she left to go back to be with her family. So they were separated during most of Lincoln's tenure as a member of Congress. And the general question of Lincoln's family life, and Whitney has a fair amount to say about that. And Whitney makes an interesting argument. He says if it hadn't been for Mary Lincoln, Lincoln may not have been president, and it may not have been a good president. And Whitney's argument goes something like this: that Mrs. Lincoln was a very difficult woman. She was very shrewish in her treatment of her husband. She physically abused him. She ridiculed him. She made home life miserable for him. And that one of the things that Lincoln learned as a result of his difficult life at home was how to deal with difficult people. and Whitney says that and here I'm doing a little quoting from the book. Let's see here. He says that such domestic discipline, that is, having to hold his temper and deal with a difficult wife, equipped him well to cope with the challenges he faced as president. And Whitney again says, we find the great emancipator possessed of an equanimity and patience which captivated the masses, while it tired out petulant grumblers like Horace Greeley and Wendell Phillips and other anti-slavery champions, abolitionists, which enabled him to force unwelcome policies on his cabinet, on Congress, and on the nation, which allowed him to bear his faculties with meekness and finally to restore peace to his bleeding country and give physical freedom to the blacks and political freedom to the whites. Had President Andy Johnson, with his unbridled temper, attempted this, he would not have got through the first year of the war. But for the domestic discipline, if it hadn't been for the domestic discipline which Mr. Lincoln underwent, he too might have failed signally. That the nation is largely indebted to Mary Lincoln Todd Lincoln for its autonomy, I do not doubt. In other words, one of his great leadership capabilities was dealing with difficult people, and he had a lot of practice at home. Now, I've written a whole book about the marriage, and it's been fairly controversial because I've adduced a lot of unflattering information about Mrs. Lincoln, about how not only was she abusive, even physically abusive of Lincoln, chasing him out of the house with a knife, chasing him out of the house throwing books at him, chasing him out of the house throwing potatoes at him, and humiliating him in front of the neighbors. But also as First Lady, she engaged in all kinds of unethical activities. She accepted bribes, she accepted kickbacks, she pinched salaries of White House employees, she engaged she sold secrets, state secrets to journalists. It was really, truly embarrassing. And Lincoln tells one of his good friends, another lawyer on the circuit named Orville Browning, that he was constantly worried as president that his wife would do something to disgrace him publicly. And she did. And so if you tell that story, it's pretty ugly. Um, and it's important to recognize, and I point this out in my writings, that Mrs. Lincoln deserved to be pitied more than censured because she had a pretty tough life. She was born into a prosperous family, to be sure, in Lexington, Kentucky, but her mother died when she was 6, and anybody who loses a mother when you're that young, that's a terrible blow. Um, then her father quickly runs out and gets remarried because he's got Mary and 5 other children, so he wants somebody to take care of these kids, and so he's a second wife. But the second wife is a typical stepmother who says to her husband, "Dear, don't pay any attention to all those 6 children you had by that dead person. Pay attention to the 9 children we're going to have." And they do. They have 9 children. So Mary feels as though she's been tuned out by her father. She feels as though she's been abandoned by her mother. Now that's crazy. The mother doesn't deliberately decide to die in order to abandon the children, but apparently kids think that way when you lose a parent when you're that young. And so she had a tough row to hoe. And so what she was doing, I think, and I'm something of a psychohistorian. That's one word, by the way, psychohistorian. Um, and that's describes historians who try to apply the insights of psychology to the study of the past. And there are psychohistorians as 2 words, but I flatter myself that I don't belong to that category. Although not everybody would necessarily agree with that, but that's neither here nor there. In any event, so Mrs. Lincoln then is looking for a father surrogate. And Lincoln is 10 years older. He's a foot taller. He radiates a quality of wise, even in his 30s, of an old, wise older man. And so she marries him, and of course, to fill the void in her life because her father has tuned her out. But then all their anger at her father for having tuned her out then gets displaced onto Lincoln and makes his home life really miserable. But it did help, as Whitney argues, to make him to build his remarkable ability to deal with difficult people. And when you consider how he had the challenge of dealing with generals like George McClellan, or abolitionist editors like Horace Greeley, or abolitionist senators like Charles Sumner, or newspaper editors, cabinet members, senators, congressmen, governors. He had a remarkable equanimity and kept the Republican coalition together. And by keeping the Republican coalition together, he kept the North together. And that was the secret to winning the war. The North's advantages in terms of manpower and economic strength would prevail if the North stayed united. And that meant keeping the Republican Party united, which meant pleasing all the factions, keeping people in line, not quarreling. And one of my favorite quotes, Lincoln says to a young Union officer who was squabbling with his superiors during the war, he says, "Quarrel not at all." He says, "No man determined to make the most of himself can spare time for personal contention. Still less can he afford to take all the consequences, including the vitiating of his temper and the loss of self-control." And cast about and see if this attitude has not ruined everybody you've ever known to fall into it. That is the tendency to quarrel. So, that in a nutshell is why I think it's important to understand the nature of that marriage, and that it's not just gossip, but it really helps understand how Lincoln developed the kind of equanimity that he demonstrated as president and was able to lead the North to victory in the war.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a couple of questions
Sure,
from chat, so let's go ahead and
sure.
ask those. We have a few related to Lincoln's time as a circuit judge. Judy was interested in knowing more if there were examples or interesting anecdotes from his early life or time as a circuit judge, and what his own perspectives were during that time frame.
Sure. Well, Lincoln was not a circuit judge. He was a lawyer,
Mhm.
and he practiced in front of a judge from Bloomington, Judge David Davis. And every now and then, Davis was indisposed, and Lincoln would sometimes be asked by Davis to pinch hit as a judge. Um, but that was a very small part of his legal career. But his the legal career that Lincoln had, and well, let's remember that was his main source of income for 20 some years. He was a practicing lawyer. A lot of presidents have law degrees, but almost none of them were really practicing lawyers for the bulk of the period of the adult life before they became president. Um, and so Lincoln's history as an attorney. Um, well, there's some good anecdotes about Lincoln as a lawyer. Um, one of my favorites involves a story where Lincoln was making an argument before a jury, um, and he had carefully laid out his case, and then the opposing attorney had laid out his case, and then they took a break, lunch break. And during that time, Lincoln gathered around. He was just chatting with some of the jurors and some of the onlookers, and he was telling a joke, a slightly off-color joke. Well, Lincoln loved off-color humor. And he said there was a young boy on a farm who came running up to his dad and said, "Dad, Dad," he says, uh, the hired hand and sis are in the hayloft, and he has pulled down his pants, and she's hiked up her skirts, and they're going to pee on the hay." And the father says, "Son, your description of the events is accurate, but your conclusions are wrong." And so after lunch, then Lincoln addresses the jury and says, "Well, my honorable colleague at the bar has laid out the facts of this case very carefully, but his conclusions are wrong." And the jury then also cracks up because they remember this joke. And so Lincoln won that case. So that's one of the more humorous examples of Lincoln as a lawyer. And of course, there are two. And then the most important case that had national implications, which is a somewhat technical question, but it was the Rock Island Bridge case. And that was really that had huge implications because the Rock Island Bridge was the first bridge across the Mississippi River. And so the whole railroad industry was eager to tap these resources on the west of the Mississippi. And but meantime, St. Louis and other river towns were eager for and the railroads not to do that. And so there was a lot riding on whether or not the bridge obstructed river traffic. And shortly after the bridge was opened, a boat, a freight boat, crashes into one of the abutments and sinks. And Lincoln defends the railroad and makes the argument that surely the ship owners have the right to go up and down the Mississippi, and railroad owners have the right to cross it, and that the economic benefits that will accrue to everybody to have both of those means of transportation available. And he wins the case, and it turns out to be one of the most significant. And then there's a big case about the railroad, the Illinois Central Railroad. Could it be taxed by counties? McLean County wanted to levy a tax on the Illinois Central, which would have ruined the finances. Because if they had won that case, then every county through which the railroad proceeded would be able to tax the road. And the Illinois legislature had set up the corporation, the Illinois Central Railroad, saying that they would pay into the state of Illinois coffers a fixed percentage of their profits, but they wouldn't be taxable by the individual counties for the properties that were stations and rail yards and the like that were in the various counties. Otherwise, it would have bankrupted it. So Lincoln really helped the railroads a lot in that tax case and in the Rock Island Bridge case. Now, sometimes Lincoln is written off as just a corporation lawyer, a railroad lawyer, but that's not true. If you look at the overwhelming bulk of his cases, didn't involve railroads, and that half of the time that he was involved in railroad cases, he was suing the railroads on behalf of farmers whose cows had been injured or whose property had been damaged by flames that were caused by the sparks from the railroads. And so Lincoln was not he represented railroads who were being sued by farmers, and he represented farmers who were suing the railroad. So he was really a lawyer for hire. Now it is true that he had a retainer from the Illinois Central, was paid a fee every year just to be on their staff, in effect, as a kind of adjunct member of the staff. But that he wouldn't sue that particular railroad as long as he had the retainer. But he was suing. There were lots of other railroads in Illinois at that time, of course, and he sued some of them, and he represented some of them in cases where they were being sued.
Got it. Thank you. Kind of following up on that question, then, we did also have a question about Lincoln's qualities as a lawyer. What were some of his best qualities, and were there any elements of law with which he struggled?
Well, Lincoln was something that isn't fully appreciated by most people, is that in addition to his many virtues of moral fiber and wisdom and psychological wholeness and all that, Lincoln was very smart. He had a very high IQ. He had a very powerful logical mind. And when he argued a case, he was able to get to the essence of what the case was about and lay out an analysis of the evidence and the conclusion to which that evidence, if you drew inferences from the evidence logically, would vindicate his client's case. And so Lincoln's effectiveness as a lawyer depended partly upon his intellect. This is a powerful, logical intellect. And Lincoln loved logic for fun, for recreational reading. When Lincoln was riding the circuit after he returned from Congress, and he was in his early 40s, and he would be riding from Danville to Champaign to DeWitt, whatever. He would have a book in his saddlebags, and it was the first 6 books of Euclid's geometry, which he read for fun. So he loved logic. He loved the mathematical logic, and he applied it to his law practice. He also had a very winning manner in dealing with juries. He was obviously fair-minded. He was easygoing. He was very courteous to his opposing counsel. He would concede. Was a standard tactic of Lincoln, which just makes sense, that he would concede all the points that his opponent was making that were relatively minor and of not much great consequence. And then sometimes his clients would blanch as he seemed to be giving away his case. But then when it came to the crucial consideration, he would do an about face and clinch the argument. And that his manner, his personality, as well as his powerful logical mind, made him an effective jury lawyer and also an appellate lawyer. But in fact, his heart was not in the law. His heart was in politics. And one of the reasons he goes into law is because he wanted to be in politics. He ran for office at the age of 23 before he was even thinking about being a lawyer. And he was defeated the first time around. And he was defeated in part because during the campaign season, he had joined the militia and was engaged with them in conducting the Black Hawk War in the summer of 1832. And so Lincoln wasn't interested in law, but he met somebody who thought he was smart and was a lawyer, and who took him under his wing and urged him to become a lawyer. And Lincoln thought, and this guy was also in Congress, that he would like to be a lawyer, or like to be a member of Congress, like to be a member of the state legislature. And so he signed up with this gentleman, John Todd Stewart, who was, as to say, a member of Congress. And but realizing that the way to become politically electable was to be a lawyer. So he practiced law mainly to put bread on the table, not because he loved it so much, but it was the ticket to becoming a lawmaker as a member of a legislature, or then eventually as a president. So those are I think the most important general points to bear in mind when we talk about Lincoln the lawyer.
Great. All right. Then, does anyone else have any questions in chat? If not, I have another question for you. Um, I've come across a number of cases that Lincoln was engaged with in Champaign County on his tour of the Eighth Circuit.
Right,
One
right.
that specifically stood out to me was Champaign's county's first murder conviction, which was William Weaver's murder trial I believe, in the late 1850s. I was wondering if that ever had come up in any discussion that Lincoln had with Whitney, or if that had ever come up as a retrospective for him.
Not that shows up in Lincoln the Citizen. And my recollection of the life on the circuit is that there isn't a great deal about that murder case. And Lincoln specialized in property law, and Lincoln was not to make too light of it, but Lincoln was a repo man, right? An awful lot of his law business was based upon people giving promissory notes to others, saying, "I promise to pay you a certain amount of money for this service." Or these goods, and then they would renege on them when the due date came, and Lincoln would then be hired to sue, and that's an awful lot of what law was about in those days, the kind of law that Lincoln practiced anyway. But every now and then he would get a murder case, but that was relatively peripheral to his main focus as a property lawyer, in effect. And the famous case is the Almanac case that was argued in Sangamon County, was the famous moonshine case, where a murder case was involved. A witness testified that Lincoln's client struck somebody with a blackjack, in effect, and killed him. And he was able to see because it was at night and the moon was out and it was shining brightly. And Lincoln got an almanac and showed that in fact the moon was low in the sky at that time, and that Lincoln freed and the accused was the son of somebody who had befriended him when Lincoln was a nobody, arrived in New Salem at the age of 22, not knowing anybody. So it was that murder case was pretty significant. But the Weaver case is not one that I'm familiar with, that he wrote about, or Whitney wrote about. But Whitney does have a lot to say about Lincoln's general style and his deportment and the quality of his mind. And this is it's an interesting summary about, but that particular case is not one that is highlighted in either of his books, as far as I know.
So we had a follow up on Lincoln's time as a circuit lawyer. You had mentioned how he had attempted a run in politics and was unsuccessful,
Right.
and then began his career as a circuit lawyer. Was just interested in knowing a little bit more detail. Nancy was wondering, kind of, was it considered more of like a plum assignment, or was it lucrative enough to be able to consider for like a full time career? And why would Lincoln select that as his potential path towards politics?
Well, that was almost all the members of the successful members of the legislature, and members of Congress were lawyers. So that would seem like the obvious path. And also, Lincoln was raised to drudgery on the farm. He was a farm laborer, and he didn't like that at all. And so, and he was he had a very unfortunate relationship with his father, a very strained relationship. And his father was an unambitious, illiterate farmer and sometime carpenter. And so Lincoln was raised in pretty straitened circumstances, and he desired to get out of that world. And one of the ways to get out of that world, and he also wanted other people to be able to get out of that world. That rural isolation on the frontier meant that people were going to be poor. Um, and what would allow people to rise in the world and to prosper was for them to have means by transportation, rivers and canals and railroads, to enter a market, to be able to sell their goods, to sell their crops, not just to local neighbors, but through a larger market, and that to promote through government uh, railroads, canals, river and harbor improvements, macadamized roads, and the like, would free people from rural isolation and backwardness and ignorance and poverty and drunkenness and the like that he had observed on the frontier. And so when we think about Lincoln as a liberator in his second career, that is, when he becomes a champion of the anti-slavery movement, it was in a sense a kind of continuation of his earlier career, because in his early career he viewed himself as championing policies which would liberate people from rural isolation and backwardness and ignorance and poverty. And then then he was thinking primarily people like the people he knew when he was growing up. But then when in his second career, he then expands his desire to liberate people uh, by championing the anti-slavery cause, so that there is sometimes even I think I'm somewhat guilty of this, of overemphasizing the difference between the first career and the in politics and the second career, because there is that underlying concern. And if you look at some of Lincoln's early speeches in the 1830s and 40s, which ostensibly are not about slavery, if you look closely at the language and the imagery and the tone, you'll see that he's really has a subtext, which is anti-slavery. Um, so the first half of Lincoln's career and the second half have more in common than sometimes is acknowledged.
All right, thank you. It is just about 8 o'clock, so we do have time for maybe one or two more questions. So if you do have any more questions that you'd like to ask, make sure to put those in the chat. One thing that, at the very least, I've heard about Lincoln's time during his youth wasn't just about his career, but also his athleticism. One thing that
Oh
I've come
yes,
across
yes,
a couple
right.
of times was that Lincoln was an avid boxer and wrestler. Were there any discussions of that in
Oh
Whitney's work?
yeah. Yes, well, Whitney didn't know him, of course, at that
Mhm.
stage, but he does talk about the reputation that Lincoln acquired as a wrestler, because Lincoln was unusually tall. He was 6'4", which would be like being 6'8" today, and very long limbed and muscular. And so he was a very accomplished wrestler, and enjoyed that. And every time he would, when he was in the Black Hawk War, whenever he heard about somebody who was supposed to be a good wrestler from another county, he would challenge him, and they would tussle. So Lincoln was a gifted athlete, and at least in that particular sport, and was proud of it. Uh,
I was wondering, just to kind of further that, since we don't have any questions from the chat yet, did that have any repercussions on his potential political career, either positive or negative?
Oh yes, yes. The fact that well, when he arrives in New Salem, the little village in Sangamon County, after leaving his parents who had settled in Macon County, um, that that when he arrived in the village, he was challenged to a wrestling match by the tough guy of the village, and uh, so Lincoln had engaged in a wrestling match with him, and it was pretty much a draw. And then all of a sudden, the opponent engaged in a tactic which was considered uh, illegal in a wrestling match, and threw Lincoln. Uh, and Lincoln's supporters were all upset, and Lincoln said, "No, no, it's all right, it's okay." And he refused to take it personally. He refused to get up and holler and complain, and he was a good sport. And that helped win him a lot of affection and respect from the people of New Salem, and was in some way the foundation of his original run for office, which starting off modestly as a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. So, yes, the wrestling did help. And if there's one thing that I want people to know about Lincoln, which is not related to Whitney so much, but just in general, um, that uh, that Abraham Lincoln was not murdered because he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln was not murdered because he supported the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery everywhere, not just in the Confederacy. Lincoln was murdered because on April 11th, 2 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered, Lincoln gave a speech at the White House to a large audience out on the lawn, in which he said that he believed that Black people should be allowed to vote, at least those who had served in the Army and those who were very intelligent, by which we assume he meant literate. And this was the first time that Lincoln had publicly taken a stand regarding Black suffrage. And he had been taunted by Douglas and others. You people always, you all want Black people to vote and hold, sit on juries and intermarry with whites and all that. The opponents of the Republicans were shameless race baiters. And so Lincoln had tended to soft pedal that issue. But now that the war was over, this was an issue that needed to be addressed. And so he calls publicly, cut publicly for the first time, and John Wilkes Booth is in the audience. And he is enraged because he's a deep-dyed racist, a real hardcore racist. And he turns to his companions and he says, that means N-word citizenship. That's the last speech he's ever going to give. By God, I'm going to run him through. And so, and then 3 days later, 3 days after John Wilkes Booth hears this speech and makes that remark to his fellow conspirators, he carries out that threat and he murders Lincoln. And so I think it's appropriate for us in the 21st century to regard Lincoln as a martyr to Black voting rights and Black civil rights, as much as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or any of the people who were murdered as they championed the civil rights revolution of the 1960s.
All right, thank you. It doesn't look like we have any other questions, but at the very least, in regards to your recent book, I was interested to know if you wouldn't mind wrapping up for us tonight by one thing that you think provides a good look at Lincoln's life through Whitney's perspective.
Uh, well, his analysis of Lincoln's character, there's his not just his ability as a lawyer, but his candor, his integrity, his forthrightness, his affability. It's a wonderful character sketch because here's a guy who really knew Lincoln well. Because when you're out on the circuit together for weeks on end, you have dinner together, you have lunch together, you have breakfast together, you have leisure time together. And Whitney talks about how Lincoln would reminisce about, and so here's a guy who was close to Whitney, and who was able to describe and analyze his character with great accuracy and intelligence. And so I think it's the character sketch of Lincoln, in addition to the information about Lincoln's early life, that makes this book an unusually important addition to the Lincoln literature.
All right, thank you. Well, it is 8 o'clock, so we will call our meeting to an end. I did put in the chat, if anyone does have any further questions that we were not able to answer tonight, please send them to my email, and then I can read them to Professor Burlingame to have them answered. But otherwise, thank you so much, Professor Burlingame, for joining us tonight. It's our last History Talk of the year. This recording will be published on our YouTube page and on our website for you to be able to share. And I hope to see all of you at our History Talk in January in the new year.
Great.
All right.
Well, thank you very much, William, for inviting me. I had a grand time.
Yeah, thank you so much all for joining.
Okay, good night.